My cheating wife asked if she could dance with her friend at the party, and in that moment, a wave of emotions washed over me. My body tensed, and the look I gave her was enough for me to understand that, from now on, things would never be the same. The answer that came out of my mouth was as cruel as it was unexpected. She was shocked. Maybe he expected me to be understanding, maybe he wanted me to just wave with a forced smile, like I did so many other times. But that night was different. I knew. Deep down, something always told me that there was more between them than simple friendship. She smiled nervously, her eyes searching for some spark of permission. "Just one dance," she whispered, trying to soften the request. And there I was, standing there, wondering how I got to this point, where the simple act of dancing with a friend could have so much hidden meaning. It wasn't the first time I'd seen him. He was always around, at parties, in meetings, in casual conversations. Always with that closeness too subtle to be considered innocent, but also not open enough to be called betrayal, at least not in front of everyone. But what hurt me most wasn't his presence, but the fact that she never told me who he really was. "Of course, go ahead," I said, with a forced smile, knowing that behind that friend there was much more. And the truth, which I had discovered just a few days before, still burned in my throat like an acid that was impossible to swallow. They kept in touch in secret, messages I shouldn't have seen, memories of a past she never shared with me. And now, right in front of me, she wanted to make public the intimacy that had long been built in the shadows. They danced. She spun under the soft party lights, while my mind whirled in a whirlwind of thoughts. Every smile she threw at him, every muffled laugh, every light touch on his shoulder, they were like sharp knives piercing my trust, cutting every thread of the relationship I believed to be solid. The party seemed to unfold in slow motion, and all I could see was what was about to be lost. The woman I loved, who promised loyalty to me, was there, dancing with the past, ignoring the present we had built together. The memories came back strongly at that moment. Everything we experienced, everything I achieved for us, the nights of laughter, the peaceful mornings, now seemed distant, as if they had never existed. As if it was all just a big illusion I built for myself. She, the woman I thought I knew so well, had kept secrets, locked away parts of her life that didn't include me. And he, that friend, was the key to those parts. I still remember the moment I saw the first message. He was innocent, or at least he seemed to be. Hi, how are you, unpretentious. But then came others, long ones, full of nostalgia. Words that cannot be exchanged with a simple friend. Words that brought back what should never have left her life. An ex-love. Someone she had loved deeply before me, and who, it seemed, had never really left her heart. "What are you hiding?" I asked once, when the tension became unbearable. She laughed, as if it was ridiculous that I was jealous of someone who, according to her, meant nothing anymore. "He's just a friend, darling," he replied, but his voice trailed off for a second, betraying what his lips were trying to hide. And now they were there, in front of me, dancing. I could feel the weight of their shared past in the air, something she never bothered to tell me. The intimacy of two bodies that already knew each other from other lives, from other times, and that never really separated. The music changed, and with it, the way they looked at each other. She smiled, but not at me. He pulled her closer, and she couldn't resist. I could see what was happening, even if no one else did. That dance was the beginning of the end. I was about to lose everything, and the worst part was that there seemed to be nothing I could do to stop it. I wonder, why did she want to dance with him that night? Why, of all the people at the party, did she choose him? And most importantly, what should I do now? Stand idly by, allowing her past to destroy our present? Or make a decision that would change everything forever? The answer, which I knew, would come soon. And it would be as devastating as it was liberating. Something she would never expect. Something no one would expect. And in that moment, as they danced under the party lights, I had already made up my mind. Now, all that remained was to know what the price of this truth would be. Their house was in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by trees and with a balcony where, during summer afternoons, they used to have coffee together. Richard and Emily's marriage had lasted 7 years. 7 years of a relationship built on apparently solid foundations, with the respect and mutual admiration that many couples envied. They were the type of couple that people admired at parties, always smiling, always in tune. Richard was a man of presence, with his polite manner and an air of confidence that gave security to whoever was around him. He worked as a financial consultant, had a respectable career and always maintained a discreet and reserved demeanor, characteristics that made Emily fall in love with him right from the start. Emily, on the other hand, was an engaging woman. The kind of person who lit up the room when he walked in. Intelligent, charming and outgoing, she knew how to be the center of attention without trying too hard. Working as an event organizer, her social life was busy, full of parties, cocktails and meetings. It was during one of these events that she and Richard met, and since then, their relationship has become a kind of balance between his focused, controlled world and her expansive, dynamic universe. Despite their differences, they complemented each other in a natural way. Richard had always been more of a homebody, preferring to spend his evenings with a good book or watching movies, while Emily was moved by the energy of people, conversations and social encounters. And for a long time, this dynamic worked well. He admired the way she easily connected with people, and she appreciated the calm he brought to her life. They seemed to live in harmony, each with their own space and particularities. However, in recent months, Richard felt something different. Small signs that started to bother me. The nights when Emily arrived later, saying that events were dragging on, or the moments when she was absorbed in her cell phone, smiling discreetly at messages he couldn't see. Not that he was a jealous man, but the sudden change in her behavior was hard to ignore. He had already wondered if he was exaggerating, if his mind was creating situations that didn't exist, but the feeling that something was out of place was increasingly present. On that particular night, they were invited to the birthday party of an important client of Emily's, something she insisted Richard attend as well. "It will be good for you to relax a little, get out of the house and have fun," she said, with that infectious smile that he always found impossible to resist. He accepted the invitation, although parties like that were not his ideal scenario. The client's home was a sophisticated place, with bright lights and soft music in the background. The kind of environment where people chatted over light laughter and glasses of wine. Richard stood by Emily's side, watching how she moved easily between groups, talking, laughing, hugging acquaintances. He loved her for that, for her ability to connect. It was something he himself had never had, that ability to make people around him feel special. Between one conversation and another, Richard noticed the arrival of a man he didn't know. Tall, dark-haired, dressed with casual elegance, he soon mingled with the guests, greeting some in a relaxed manner. Richard watched as the man walked over to Emily, and the hug they shared was a little too long for his liking. He felt a slight discomfort, but forced himself to ignore it. After all, Emily knew a lot of people. It was part of her job to be close to her clients and friends. When the man walked away and mingled with the other guests, Emily returned to Richard, commenting on how incredible the party was. "This is Michael, he's a good friend of mine," she said casually, as if his presence there was no big deal. Richard nodded, but there was something about the way she spoke of him that didn't completely convince him. The night continued, and although Richard tried to distract himself, Michael's presence always seemed to hover over them. He watched him from afar, laughing with other guests, occasionally exchanging glances with Emily. There was something about the man that bothered Richard, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was the fact that Emily, who used to be so transparent, now seemed different around him, more attentive, more present in a way Richard hadn't seen in a long time. The party was in full swing when Emily turned to Richard with a question that, under other circumstances, would seem innocent: "Do you mind if I dance with Michael? It's been so long since we've seen each other, it would be fun." She was smiling, but there was a subtle tension in her request. Something that made Richard's stomach turn. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. It was as if all the doubts he had been trying to shake off over the last few weeks had returned with a vengeance. "Of course," he said, his voice calmer than he actually felt. Inside, however, something was breaking apart. He knew it wasn't just a dance. That request, that closeness that he had noticed all night, everything pointed to something deeper, something he wasn't prepared to face. As Emily walked towards Michael, Richard watched from afar. His heart was racing, his mind was spinning with thoughts that he tried hard to suppress. He knew something was about to change between them. Something that, until that moment, he had refused to see, but which now became impossible to ignore. Richard had never imagined that his life with Emily would come to this point. They had everything, a life built with affection, respect and love. But there, on the dance floor at that party, he began to question everything he thought he knew about her, about them. The certainties he had until then began to dissolve, leaving in their place an uncomfortable emptiness and a doubt that grew every minute. And as the two danced, he wondered how this man had come so silently into their lives. Richard watched from afar as Emily and Michael moved together to the music. The dance floor was wide, but, to him, it seemed too small for the proximity between the two. The smiles they exchanged, the looks, the subtle touches, it all seemed natural to the outsider, but to Richard, every movement seemed like a cruel reminder of what he had been trying to deny for the past few weeks. The feeling that he was losing his wife, that something was slipping out of his hands, grew with every step they took. He remained still for a few minutes, trying to convince himself that nothing was wrong. After all, it wouldn't be Emily's first time dancing with friends. She had always been outgoing, sociable, someone who easily attracted people around her. But that night, something was different. Something about the way she looked at Michael, as if they were alone among all those people, made him uneasy. Richard tried to push away the thoughts that arose, but the doubts insisted on taking root. As the two spun around the track, Richard felt a growing discomfort. He decided to move away from the crowd, seeking some fresh air in the house's garden. The music and laughter continued in the background, but he could no longer pay attention. In her mind, the images of the night repeated themselves, like a movie in slow motion, Emily smiling at Michael, his hands on her body, the way she tilted her head slightly when she heard him say something in her ear. Every detail seemed to amplify what he already knew but didn't want to admit. Sitting on a bench in the garden, Richard recalled the moments when he began to notice the changes in Emily. The increasingly frequent excuses to stay late at work, the phone calls she answered away from him, the sparkle of excitement in her eyes when she mentioned meetings and events that he wasn't part of. He had tried to ignore these signs, chalking it all up to tiredness or the fact that they were at different stages in their lives. But the truth was, he had always known, on some level, that something more was going on. He felt his cell phone vibrate in his pocket and, for a moment, he thought about checking his messages, but decided against it. Nothing on the device could erase what was happening right before their eyes. He remained there, motionless, observing the stars in the clear sky, but without being able to really see them. The weight of what was to come crushed him. After a while, he went back inside. The party was still lively, but his eyes immediately sought Emily. She was in a corner of the room, talking to Michael, their bodies too close, sharing something that seemed much more intimate than it should have been. Richard felt his heart racing and cold sweat running down the back of his neck. He decided to approach, his steps slow, as if he were walking towards something he knew would destroy him. When she finally got close, Emily pulled away from Michael abruptly, as if she had been caught in a forbidden act. Her gaze met his, and Richard saw, for a brief second, the fear in his wife's eyes. But she quickly covered it up, smiling again as if nothing had happened. "Are you okay?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but her slightly shaky voice gave away that something was wrong. "Yeah, I just needed some air," Richard replied, forcing a smile he knew was fake. But he didn't want to confront her there, in the middle of the party, in front of everyone. There was a limit to his dignity that he still tried to preserve. The night continued, but Richard could no longer concentrate. Every laugh from Emily sounded like a taunt, every gesture seemed stamped with confirmation of what he feared. When the party finally came to an end, he was already exhausted, emotionally drained. They said goodbye to their hosts, and Emily, now a little more distant, no longer mentioned Michael. On the way back home, the silence between them was suffocating. Emily looked out the car window, avoiding any eye contact, while Richard kept his eyes fixed on the road. The tension was palpable, and he knew the answers he needed would come soon. I knew that night had been a turning point. They arrived home, and Emily went straight to her room. Richard stayed in the hallway for a few minutes, looking at the closed door, feeling like a stranger in his own home. He knew he could no longer delay the truth. The pain of doubt gnawed at him, and he needed answers. I needed to understand what had happened to their marriage. Entering the room, he found her sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at her cell phone with a distant look. "Is there something you want to tell me?" The question came out with a calmness he hadn't expected, but the weight behind it was clear. Emily froze for a moment, before looking up at him in surprise. "What are you talking about?" "From Michael. From both of you." Her expression changed, going from surprise to defense. "There's nothing between us. He's just a friend, Richard," she said, but her tone no longer held conviction. He knew she was lying, and the silence that followed was confirmation. "I saw you two tonight, Emily. I saw the way you look at him. And it's not just that. It's been months since I felt like you were distant. So please, tell me the truth." Silence took over the room, and Richard could see Emily's internal struggle. She knew she had been caught, she knew that lying wouldn't save her anymore. He took a deep breath, lowered his eyes, and after a long moment, finally said the words he feared to hear, "Yes, me and Michael. We've been together for a while." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Richard's feet. The world he had built with her collapsed in a matter of seconds. And he knew, in that instant, that nothing would ever be the same. Richard remained motionless after Emily's confession. The betrayal, which he already suspected, had been confirmed in a direct, brutal way. The silence in the room was unbearable, as if the air was thick with all the words unspoken over those months. He could feel the crushing weight of the revelation, a tightness in his chest that couldn't lift. His world was falling apart, and he didn't know how to react. Emily remained sitting on the bed, unable to meet Richard's gaze. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held her cell phone, as if the object represented her forbidden connection with Michael. She knew she had gone too far and there was no turning back. But still, a part of her hesitated, as if there was something more to be said, a part of the truth that she had not yet revealed. "For how long?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse, as if he were trying to hold back his own despair. Emily hesitated before answering, the words catching in her throat. "A few months," she said finally, guilt evident in her tone. "But, Richard, I didn't want it to be like this." Richard took a step back, as if trying to move away from the emotional impact of those words. He needed space, needed to breathe. But every time he tried to organize his thoughts, images of Emily and Michael together invaded his mind. The idea that his wife, the woman he had shared so many moments with, was with another man was unbearable. "Didn't you want it to be like this?" Anger began to form, replacing the sadness and shock. "How did you expect it to be, Emily? How did you think I would feel when I found out my wife was cheating on me with another man?" She got up from the bed, finally facing him. I don't know," he replied, his voice barely audible. "I didn't want to hurt you." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't want to hurt me. You betrayed me, Emily. You stabbed me in the back while pretending everything was fine. And now you say you didn't want to hurt me?" She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. "Richard, I'm sorry. I really am. But, it's not that simple. Isn't it simple? He took a step towards her, the pain in his eyes brimming. You slept with another man. That seems simple enough to me. Emily swallowed hard, feeling that control of the situation was slipping out of her hands. She knew she needed to explain everything, but how? How can she put into words what she herself didn't fully understand? The relationship with Michael had been something she had never planned, but it happened naturally. Memories of the past came flooding back with a force she couldn't control. But how could he explain this to Richard without sounding like he was justifying himself? Richard, I didn't want this to happen. I didn't plan it. Michael and I, we have a history, an old connection that you don't know about. A story? Richard's surprise was evident. He always knew that Emily had a past, like anyone else, but he never imagined that that past would come back to destroy them. What's this story? Why didn't you ever tell me? She took a deep breath, as if she was about to dive into deep, dangerous waters. Michael and I dated before I met you. The words hung in the air like an invisible punch. Richard felt the ground shift beneath his feet, as if a new dimension had been added to the already devastating picture of betrayal. Did they date? He could hardly believe what he was hearing. And you never thought you should tell me this? Emily looked down, fighting back tears. I thought it was something in the past. I didn't think it was important. You didn't think it was important? The incredulity in Richard's voice was palpable. Did you think hiding the fact that you were in contact with an ex-boyfriend wasn't important? Emily began pacing back and forth, as if the movement would help her find the right words. When we met, I had already gotten over my relationship with Michael. He was important to me, but our relationship ended, and I moved on. And when I met you, I knew I wanted to be with you, that I wanted to build a life with you. Then why is he still in your life now? Richard asked, anger rising again. If you had overcome everything, why did he come back? Why did you let him come back? I don't know. Emily struggled to respond. I guess. I never completely forgot about him. When he reappeared, all the emotions came flooding back, and I couldn't resist. But please, Richard, you have to believe me, I never meant for this to hurt you. I just got lost in the middle of it all. Richard was silent, trying to process what he had just heard. The fact that not only had his wife cheated on him, but that the man she was involved with was someone from her past, someone she had never mentioned, made it even worse. It was as if each layer of betrayal went deeper than he could imagine. Did you get lost in the middle of everything? He repeated, feeling the bitter taste of those words in his mouth. Emily, you lost yourself and destroyed me in the process. I trusted you, believed we had something real. But now it feels like you were living another life behind my back. She could no longer hold Richard's gaze. I knew I had hurt him irreparably, and there was nothing I could do to turn back time. I know I made a mistake, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to understand that I never stopped loving you. What happened to Michael was a mistake. A mistake, he repeated in disbelief. You betrayed our marriage, our life, and now you want me to believe it was just a mistake. Emily began to cry, her voice breaking with emotion. Richard, I'm so sorry. I let myself get carried away by something I thought I was over, but I never wanted to hurt you. He watched her for a long moment, his mind racing with a mix of emotions. The love he felt for her was being swallowed by resentment, by betrayal. And then, something inside him broke. He knew that nothing she said could fix what had been destroyed. I don't know if I can forgive you, Emily, he said, his voice low but full of determination. I don't know if I can keep living with someone who kept such a huge part of her life from me. You betrayed me, not just with Michael, but with the lies, with the secrets. And I don't know if we can come back from this. She looked at him, her eyes full of tears and despair, but there were no more words that could heal the open wound between them. Richard turned, leaving the room without looking back as the weight of betrayal finally fell on him like an avalanche. Richard drove through the city aimlessly. The street lights flickered as he passed, but he barely noticed them. All he could feel was the crushing weight of Emily's revelation, a pain that seemed to grow with every mile he advanced. The betrayal was enough to destroy him, but what killed him inside was the fact that the man Emily was involved with was someone she had already loved, someone she hid the entire time they were together. The questions kept flooding into her mind. Why didn't she ever tell him about Michael? Why did she think she could hide something like that? And more than that, what did he really mean to her? As he drove, Richard began to think about everything that had happened between them in the last few months. The nights Emily came in late, the lame excuses, the messages she tried to hide. Everything started to make sense, and he hated himself for not realizing it sooner. There were signs, and he ignored them. Or worse, he wanted to believe that she would never do something like that. When he finally parked the car in a deserted park, Richard rested his head on the steering wheel, trying to fight the flood of emotions that overwhelmed him. Emily's betrayal left him disoriented, lost. And deep down, there was something he couldn't shake, the feeling that he didn't know the whole truth. Richard knew the only way to find the answers he needed was to confront Michael. He needed to look the man in the eye and hear his side of the story, know exactly what had happened between them. He needed clarity, no matter how painful it was. Without thinking twice, he took out his cell phone and looked for Michael's number. There was a rising anger in his chest, a desire for revenge but also a need to understand why this happened. He typed quickly, the sound of the taps echoing in his head until Michael's voice sounded on the other end of the line. "Hello," Michael said, his voice calm and unconcerned. "We need to talk," Richard said, trying to control the anger in his voice. "Richard," the surprise in Michael's voice was evident. "What's going on? Now is not a good time." "I don't care if it's a good time or not. You destroyed my life, and I want answers. Now." There was silence on the other end, and Richard could sense Michael's hesitation. "Okay. We'll meet at the corner cafe in half an hour." Richard hung up the phone without answering, feeling the blood pulsing through his veins. He knew that this meeting could be the key to discovering the whole truth. He needed to understand why Emily chose Michael, what was so special about him that she would throw away everything they had built together. Arriving at the cafe, he saw Michael already sitting at one of the tables, playing on his cell phone. As Richard approached, he looked up and, for a moment, looked nervous, as if he didn't know exactly how to approach the situation. So, Richard began, sitting down at the table, without taking his eyes off Michael. "How long have you and Emily been cheating on me?" Michael sighed, putting his cell phone aside. "Look, Richard, I know you're furious, and you have every right to be. But me and Emily, it wasn't planned. It just happened." "Did it just happen?" Richard's voice was full of sarcasm. "Did you two think it was a good idea to destroy a 7-year marriage because you reunited?" Michael shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with Richard's intensity. "I didn't want things to be like this. I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why did you get involved with my wife?" Richard pressed. "What do you have that I don't, Michael? What makes you so special to her?" Michael hesitated, looking down at the table before looking up again. I don't know if I'm special. But what Emily and I had in the past has never been completely overcome by either of us." Richard felt like he had been hit again. He always thought Emily's past was buried, that he was the only man she really wanted to be with. But hearing from Michael that they had never gotten over what they had was devastating. "So you guys just kept it hidden the whole time?" "She never told me about you." "She tried to protect you," Michael replied, his voice low. "I think she thought that if you knew, things would change. Maybe she was right." Richard was silent for a moment, processing everything that had been said. He knew there was something more, something Michael hadn't told him yet. "Is there anything else I need to know?" Richard asked, his voice now calm but full of determination. "Because if there is, I want to hear it now." Michael looked down, visibly uncomfortable. He knew he was about to cross a line, but he could no longer hide what was really happening. Yes, Richard, there is something else. The silence that hung between Richard and Michael in the cafe was suffocating. Michael had just revealed that there was something more, something he was hesitant to share, and Richard knew the truth wasn't complete yet. He felt like he was about to be confronted with the final, irrevocable reality, something that would change everything forever. The cafe, once a welcoming place, now felt cold and impersonal, as if it were the perfect setting for Richard's life to fall apart. "Speak quickly, Michael," Richard murmured, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I already know that Emily cheated on me. I already know that you two have a history. What else can there be?" Michael looked away, clearly struggling to find the right words. He knew that the next revelation would destroy any hope Richard might have had for his marriage. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked at him. "Richard, she didn't want you to know. But I think you deserve the truth." Richard leaned forward slightly, his heart racing, his body tense. "Then tell me the truth. I can take it." Michael looked down at the table, his fingers intertwined, as if seeking strength in words. "When Emily and I got back together, it wasn't just about old feelings. Things started innocently enough, but quickly changed. And now, she's pregnant, Richard." The words hit Richard like a punch in the gut. Pregnant? He blinked several times, trying to absorb what he had just heard. He felt his body stiffen, the heat of anger and betrayal flooding his chest. It was as if the world was crumbling around him, and he was powerless to stop it. "Are you telling me that my wife is pregnant with another man's child?" His voice was broken, almost a whisper, as he tried to process the magnitude of that revelation. Michael nodded slowly, his expression heavy with the guilt he could no longer hide. "She was scared to tell you. She didn't know how you would react. But, you can't hide it anymore. She needs you to know." Richard stood up abruptly from the table, pushing his chair back. He felt the blood pulsing in his head, and for a moment he thought he would lose control. All the trust he had placed in Emily, all the life they had built together, was destroyed. How could he even begin to process the idea that the woman with whom he had shared years of love and companionship was now carrying another man's child? This is unbelievable," he murmured, running his hands through his hair, as if the gesture could alleviate the growing pain inside him. You two destroyed everything." Michael was silent. He knew there was no excuse, that nothing he said could erase what had been done. The damage was irreparable, and now there was only pain. Richard, still in disbelief, turned to leave, but stopped for a moment, looking at Michael once more. "Did you know from the beginning that this could happen? That it could end like this?" Michael hesitated for a second, and then shook his head. I didn't think it would come to this. But yes, I knew we were playing with fire. I knew the risk. And yet, still we continued." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. The confirmation that Michael and Emily had moved on, aware of the consequences, was devastating. He felt betrayed in a way words couldn't express. It wasn't just the fact that Emily was pregnant with Michael, it was the fact that she deliberately chose to hide that part of him, choosing to stay true to another story, to another man, while he, Richard, lived a lie. Without saying anything else, Richard left the cafe, leaving Michael behind. The cool night air hit his face like a shock, but he found no relief. He didn't know where to go, what to do next. All he knew was that he could no longer continue pretending that his life, as he knew it, still existed. Every piece of their marriage, every promise, every memory, was now tainted by betrayal and lies. Driving aimlessly, he tried to find clarity amid the chaos. How could Emily do this to him? Their marriage had been built on trust, love and mutual respect. Now, it seemed like all that had never really existed, that it was an illusion he had fed while she kept secrets. The idea that Emily was carrying a child that wasn't hers was unbearable. The future he imagined, with a family in a safe home, was now shattered. Arriving home, darkness enveloped him like a heavy cloak. He entered the living room and looked around, seeing the furniture, the photos, the objects that once represented his life with Emily. Everything felt empty now. It all seemed like a lie. He climbed the stairs in silence, each step heavier than the last. When he arrived in the room, he found Emily sitting on the bed, waiting for him. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she knew that Richard already knew everything. "Did you speak to Michael?" she asked in a low voice, almost powerless. Richard just nodded, unable to look directly at her. The silence that followed was filled with unbearable tension. He wanted to scream, he wanted to express all the pain he felt, but at the same time, he didn't know where to start. Emily stood up, approaching him cautiously. "Richard, I'm so sorry. I never wanted things to come to this." He finally looked up, and the look he gave her was one of pure disbelief. "You're pregnant, Emily," he said, unable to control the pain in his voice. "You betrayed me and now you're carrying another man's child. How did you expect this to end?" Emily began to cry again, but her tears no longer moved him. Richard was beyond the point of compassion. All he saw now was the destruction of everything he believed to be true. She tried to get closer, but he took a step back, keeping his distance. "I can't do this, Emily," he said, his voice firm but tired. "I can't live with this. I can't live with you after all this." She sobbed, desperate. "Please, Richard. I love you. I know I messed up, but we can get through this together. We can find a way." He shook his head, feeling his heart tighten. "No, Emily. There are no more us. Not after this." The words were final, like a final blow. Richard knew it was over. I knew there was no going back. Her betrayal, the child she carried, everything had broken something inside him that could never be repaired. He turned, leaving the room without looking back, knowing that from that moment on, life as he knew it was over. The door to the house closed behind Richard with a final bang. He walked down the porch steps, not knowing exactly where he was going, but with the certainty that this would be the last step he would take alongside Emily. The rain was beginning to fall lightly, a reflection of the storm unfolding within him. Richard walked with heavy steps, feeling the cold penetrate his skin, but nothing was colder than the emptiness in his heart. He always thought that love could endure everything, that time and forgiveness would be able to heal wounds, but now, he found himself facing a reality where those words no longer had meaning. As he walked, scenes from the last few hours flashed through his mind, Emily's face as she confessed her betrayal, Michael's words, the devastating revelation of her pregnancy. All of this was like an open wound, which bled endlessly, eating away at every fiber of what was left of his dignity. The man he had been until that moment, the loyal husband, the lifelong companion, no longer existed. It was destroyed that night, and now there was only the shell of someone trying to make sense of the rubble. Back at the house, Emily stood in her room for a few minutes, unable to process the coldness of Richard's last words. Her body shook, not from fear, but from a deep pain, a pain she had caused herself. The tears streaming down his face were of regret, but also of despair. She knew she had lost Richard forever. There was no turning back. As much as she tried to justify to herself the reasons that led her to get closer to Michael, now, everything seemed meaningless. What did she gain? What's left? She slowly descended the stairs, each step heavy with guilt and remorse. The house seemed emptier than ever, and Richard's absence was suffocating. As she looked around, she realized that all the details of that home, the photos, the furniture, the small decorative items, now carried a weight that she could no longer bear. She had betrayed the man who loved her, and there was no turning back from that betrayal. Emily knew that the path she chose to follow had led her to the point of no return. She took out her cell phone and, with trembling fingers, sent a message to Michael. "Richard knows everything. I don't know what else to do." While waiting for a response, he sat on the couch, staring into space. She thought about how different everything could have been. How, if I had made different choices, maybe I would still be by Richard's side, building the life they always dreamed of. But now, all she had was an empty house and an uncertain future. Michael responded shortly after, "We need to talk. I'll see you later." Emily knew there was no more later with Michael. What they had was not love, it was not what she had imagined. It was all just an escape, a frustrated attempt to relive something that belonged to the past. Now, it was too late. She was alone, completely alone. Meanwhile, Richard drove through the dark streets, without a clear destination. He didn't want to go back home, to that house that was now stained by betrayal. The memories of the happy moments he had shared with Emily seemed distant and unreal, as if they belonged to another life. He stopped the car in an empty square and stayed there for some time, reflecting on everything that had happened. The pain he felt wasn't just from what Emily did, but from the sense of loss that accompanied it. He wasn't just losing the woman he loved, he was losing the life he built, the future he imagined. Richard knew he needed to move on, but at that moment, everything seemed impossible. Time passed, and dawn gave way to dawn. The sky was beginning to lighten when Richard finally made a decision. He knew he couldn't stay here, trapped in a cycle of pain and anger. He needed a fresh start, away from everything that reminded him of Emily's betrayal. Upon returning home for the last time, Richard collected some things. Emily was in the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen from crying. When she saw him, she tried to say something, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. "I'm going away, Emily. There's nothing more to be said," he said, with a calmness that surprised even himself. She nodded, knowing that any plea for forgiveness would be futile. They had come to an end, and that was something she would need to accept. Richard left without looking back, carrying nothing but himself. He knew the journey to rebuilding himself would be long, but somehow, he was at peace with the decision. As for Emily, she stayed in that house for some time, trying to deal with the consequences of her choices. Michael disappeared from her life shortly after, when he realized that what they had wouldn't survive the chaos they created. She then found herself alone, having to face the mistakes of the past without anyone to support her. In the end, what was left was silence. A heavy but revealing silence. Richard moved on with his life, rebuilding what had been destroyed, while Emily carried the weight of her choices, knowing she would never be the same. Did you like the story? Leave your comment below about what you thought of the plot and the character choices. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And remember, our channel does not support any type of betrayal or unfair behavior. Until next time.